Good evening, everyone. My name is David Pettyjohn, and I am the Executive Director of the Idaho Humanities Council. Thank you for joining us this evening for a special edition of our Connected Conversations series. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to remind everyone that you may submit questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may also use the chat feature. Tonight's program is part of the 2021 IHC Summer Teacher Institute that officially kicked off today at the College of Idaho in Caldwell. This year's topic is Get Up, Stand Up, Resistance Through Popular Music and Poetry, and the Institute participants will examine protest poetry and music as scholars focus on an exploration of historical and contemporary protest expressions around the country. The IHC Summer Teacher Institutes are made possible with support from IHC's Humanities Education Endowment and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, joining us this evening is Major Jackson. He is one of the scholars for this year's institute and will be presenting to the participants tomorrow morning. But tonight, it is our pleasure to have him joining us as part of this Connected Conversations. A little bit of background. Major Jackson is the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently, The Absurd Man in 2020, a recipient of fellowships from the John S. Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Major has been awarded a Pushcart Prize, Whiting Writers Award, and has been honored by the Pew Fellowship in the Arts and the Witter Bynner Foundation in conjunction with the Library of Congress. He currently lives in Nashville, where he is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University, and he serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. And during our conversation before you all joined us this evening, he is a past board president for one of our sister organizations, the Vermont Humanities Council. Major, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, David. Very happy to join you this evening. And I am also honored to be part of this year's Teachers Institute. I think it's a great theme and one in which will guide my readings this evening. I'm gonna start off with a little short piece that I wrote for a writers' conference, a poetry conference in China, probably 2017, 2018. And some of the themes that I touch upon here has to do with the complexities of being a writer, particularly a writer of color who is called to address the issues, social and political issues, but also called to be a poet. This is called Ancient Enmity. As regards poetry, my wisdoms are few, but one claim I can comfortably make, despite all my efforts at aesthetic control, the rage towards an ordered music, the linguistic dance of intellect and feeling, the intuitions and declarations, the emblematic silences between sentences when my hands pause over the keyboard, or when my pencil lifts from the page, lost between sounds, whose soulful leaps and stations of meaning eventually, like a meandering river, or this sentence, snake and wind towards some clarifying and authoritative song. Despite the poem originating from the unique set of social, political, and experiential conditions and factors that is my life, Major Jackson, born to Lavorne and Gloria in 1968, the year of tumultuous revolt in America that led to the covert and overt killings of Black leaders and their white allies, who rigorously fought for my right to be treated as a human of equal intelligence and worthy of the dignity that is afforded any of God's creatures. Despite the poem's magical and mysterious emergence into the world that will bear my name as the author, I no more own the poem than any of us own a cloud or the dizzying scent of a gardenia or rose, which is to say, the poem exists outside of the poet, and whatever circumstances that gave rise to its creation are mute, for it has entered into the great song, all those other works of the human imagination that give texture to our creaturely existence, that record our loves, our pains, slights, hurts, joys, jealousies, protests, prayers, ecstasies, and sorrows. With respect to young poets like Amanda Gorman, I think of those works that preceded her by James Baldwin, Gwendolyn Brooks, Adrienne Rich, Dennis Brutus, Adam Zagajewski, Maya Angelou, Elizabeth Bishop, Seamus Heaney, Amiri Baraka, Pablo Neruda, Allen Ginsberg, Joseph Brodsky, Derek Walcott. When I consider the theme of our gathering, Get Up, Stand Up, this is something I remember. Poetry's utilitarian purposes and the reader, the palm at the end of the mind, as Wallace Stevens phrases it in his poem of Mere Being. Poetry has many uses, many valences and purposes, between the reader being instigated into thought and possibly action, or made even more aware of their loneliness. The poem exists to mediate existence. And frankly, I refuse to diminish its power into a simple occasion of witnessing, protest, or empathy. Why not at all? Much as I fail, to my chagrin, at dictating where and how my poetry should be read, which leaves me vulnerable to misinterpretations aplenty, but that's okay. I also cannot possibly imagine what quarters in the reader's heart or mind the poem will reside, what commodifications or consolations. It all seems so impenetrable when I think about it. So I don't theorize before the poem has even come into being or envision an audience standing on the front lines of some struggle, chanting my words as a rallying cry. My freedom is the freedom of any artist or a spider weaving his orbital web. And this freedom is my weapon and my right, and gives me the comfort of creating and composing with language as my material. And yet, when my appetite for language is wide, I echo the rapper when he says, quote, appetite to write like Frederick Douglass and his slave hand, which is to say, I write my freedom. I construct structures such that my spirit lives and dwells endlessly, long after my flesh and bones and blood are crushed to fill some imaginary urn. Comparatively, what I face, however, is what all artists face at some time or another, which is the narrow perception of their work serving the narrowest of functions, the imposition of the political. Early 20th century political leader and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, setting the stage for much writing by African Americans in the 20th and 21st century, once remarked, quote, whatever art I have for writing has been used always for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda. And thus, by default, many have argued that the tertiary work of African American arts and letters, or the poetry written out of that unique experience in which today I, Major Jackson, as a visible threat in the imagination of some police officers, can be inexplicably shot by the state for the mere fact of my color, has been to address, I'm sorry, I got lost in that sentence, has been to address the historical oppression of the Black community, and by implication, the spiritual and moral currents of America. I'll say that again. My poetry has been used to address the historical oppression of the Black community, and by implication, the spiritual and moral currents of America. One thinks of poets Phyllis Wheatley, and Frances Watkins Harper. Poetry which gave heft to the abolitionist movement, or Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and County Cullen, penning verse that addressed that curious phenomenon of lynchings of Black people in the early 20th century. And thus this ongoing enmity, this hostility towards Black lives, quixotically consigns to poetry by African Americans, even the most opaque poetry by such inventive contemporary writers as Will Alexander and Harriet Mullen, to the halls of mere resistance and dissent. It is not my language that is limited, but the reader's imagination of my language to have an import beyond their own self-centered depletions. Some of my friends have spoken in the past about the great struggle to come into being, how indeed that struggle is on the surface of the language, in the syntax and silences. Much in the way a poet is changed, however, by the writing of the poem, those surprises and turns, those rhymes and anaphoric repetitions, that bang of consciousness into shape, such that it radiates off the page as an intimate and necessary voice, so too the poem should reshape and reconstitute a reader, readers, communities, in our instance, students. This is the humanizing aspect of poetry that grants us the privilege to hear and encounter each other. And yes, maybe even allow us to identify with each other a little more, thus dissolving whatever physical, geographical, racial, gendered, sexual, figurative borders that exist between us. Sorry for that long prelude. I will now read a few poems. This is a poem recently published online called Let Me Begin Again. And it was published at the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, of which they asked for a bit of words to go along with the poem. And I wrote this, and I think this is appropriate for today as well. My writing is my form of action, one that finds me, may be owed to our global health, political, and climate crises, acclimating to an ever-increasing hunger to connect with a reader. The poem highlights the possibilities and joys of self-renewal and the promises of a new tomorrow. As a parent, my favorite mental pictures are of my children individually, off alone, looking curiously into an object. The poem, Let Me Begin Again, which is inspired by Philip Levine's poem of the same title, quite seriously gifts the reader that sustaining image, a Black child in wondrous thought. Let me begin again. And here, I don't mind sharing my screen. To do this. Let me begin again. Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell, slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, sifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the birdcage or the serrated blade or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed, soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds toward sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer. I am licking my lips. As you know, there have been, over the past several years, a rise in violence, particularly in holy places, in synagogues and churches. It is so rattling for me each time this kind of targeted violence happens in the world. And then in 2017, we had the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which led to the death of Heather Heyer. This poem began as a meditation on patriotism and the generosity of those who protest. And the poem calls out those marchers for their racism and anti-Semitism directly. This is a poem of protest that not only makes a case for culture and the work of poetry and friendship, but also advocates for and celebrates peaceful, nonviolent, and sacred embrace of life, of all life. In the 80s, we did the walk. If you will end your crusade for the great race, then I will end my reenactments of flying. And if you lean down to smell a painted trillium, then I will cast a closer eye on those amber waves. And if you stop killing Black children, then I will turn my drums to the sea and away from your wounded mountains, who mothered your love of death. Here is a heart-shaped stone to rub. When you feel fear rising, give me anything, an empty can of Pabst, a plastic souvenir, a t-shirt from Daytona. Here is a first edition, the complete poems of Lucille Clifton. Give me an ancient grove and a conversation by a creek, charms to solve my griefs. Something that says you are human. And I will give you the laughter in my brain and the tranquil eyes of my uncles. Show me your grin in the middle of winter. In the 80s, we did the WAP. You too have your dances. It is like stealing light from a flash in the sky. I promise no one is blaming you. No one is trying to replace you. It's just that you are carrying a tainted clock, calling it European history, standing in khakis, eyes frightened like a mess of beetles. So many of us have been advocating for joy as we struggle together. And this is a poem titled, Think of Me Laughing. You are right to imagine me sobbing on the corner of 6th Avenue and West 4th, or raising a hashtag cardboard above my head near the Liberty Bell. You are right to picture me lying down below the Gold Dome Capitol demanding don't shoot. It is my annual day of sobbing. What are these brown hands for, if not to bury my eyes in the ancient rivers of wrongs? And isn't this my consigned single note in our final piece of music, mindless as a blink? So go ahead. You and I are once again rehearsing decency. It is the dream of loving fruited plains that do not love you back. It is our feet planted in concrete that has me weep. But first, give thought to my luxuries. The sunset I toasted over the Val di Schiana with an aperitivo in Cafe Poliziano the summer of 15. Or give thought to the promontories of conversation with my father yesterday, in which, among other delights, we discussed the dignity of eggplants, whose purplish tint reminded him of a great aunt. Consider my love of celestial bodies. You're better off thinking of me singing this morning a little Marvin Gaye, not what's going on, but I want you, sultry and soulful. A one-way love is just a fantasy, oh sugar. Forgive me for being bound up and be ecstatic right now. I do not regret my little bout with life. Okay. This is from my first book, and I'm pulling together a selection of poems from the first 5 books that I published. And I was surprised to discover that in each one of my books, I have recorded some encounter with a policeman. And this is from my first book, and it's called Pest. And it takes the idea of what was popularly promulgated on the nightly news as urban Black men or boys as drug dealers, and takes that and speaks from an ironic space, sarcasm, humor of some kind. I hope you hear it. Well, the senator in this particular poem, which I just randomly chose because of its syllabic account, Delaware, happens to be our president now, but I don't name him. I just say the senator from Delaware. Cicadas are back, as you know, as are bush crickets. So the conceit of this poem, you'll hear it. It takes a pretty absurd and wild turn. It's called Pest. I heard the terrible laughter of termites deep inside a spray-painted wall on Sharswood Street. My first thought was that of Swiss cheese hardening on a counter at the American diner. My second thought was that of the senator from Delaware on the Senate floor. I was on my way to a life of bagging tiny mountains, selling poetry on the corners of North Philly, a burden to mothers and Christians. Hearing it too, the cop behind me shoved me aside, for he was an entomologist in a former lifetime and knew the many song structures of cicadas, bush crickets, and fruit flies. He knew the complex courtship of bark beetles, how the male excavates a nuptial chamber and buries himself, his back end sticking out, till a female sang a lyric of such intensity he squirmed like a Quaker and gave himself over to the quiet history of trees and ontology. All this he said while patting me down, slapping first my ribs, then sliding his palms along the sad, dark shell of my body. How lucky I was, spread eagle at 13, discovering the ruinous cry of insects as the night air flashed reds and blues, as a lone voice chirped and cracked over a radio, the city crumbling. We stood a second longer, sharing the deafening hum of termites back from their play and rest, till he swung suddenly, my right arm, then my left. And 2 more poems. Let's see. Stand Your Ground. This is a golden shovel, a double golden shovel. The first line is taken from Robert Hayden, and it goes, America as much a problem in metaphysics as it is a nation, earthly entity, an iota in our galaxy, an organism of one. And the other is from Gwendolyn Brooks. We do not want them to have less, but it is only natural that we should think we have not enough. Stand your ground, as you know, is the legal loophole that made it okay for anyone to use uh, fatal force if they believe um, that their life is in danger. And, well, stand your ground. America, how often I have applauded your flagpoles. We as citizens struggle to find common ground, yet do much to damage the planks of your ark. Not a soft tune we make, glissando of the harmonized. We have a want problem, more of ourselves problem, us versus them, in the great race to prosperity. In his introduction to physics, Heidegger asks, why are there beings at all? We have as guides, clansmen and eugenicists who proclaim all others as less. It is, I admit, the slapping of your ropes, toiling a perfect union, but is the measure of your worth a silent clang elsewhere? How is it a ripple also runs through me when your wind rises? Your cloth is nation hauled down or half-mast, like a deferred dream. That an angry man can shoot a teenager is par, as we say. We iotas, deltas, crips, knights, new tribesmen and new codes should in earnest put away our swords and talk shows. Think, our watermelons have so many seeds, and we, galaxies in us, dissolve like supernovas. The mysteries we have, an unmitigated burning of sound and fury, not organism of one, but organs. America, I've had enough. And finally, here is a poem called Mighty Poems. One of the types of poems that I'll talk about tomorrow is the poem that is affirmative in the absence of affirmative of Black life in the absence of a white audience. This has been a necessary thrust in African-American poems, not just of protest, but in thinking about how poems sustain, and if others are listening, fine, as the poets of the Black arts movement said, but the primary audience is folks taking care of each other through their words, sacred words. Mighty poems. If I told you Earl, the toughest kid on my block in North Philadelphia, bowleg and ominous, could beat any man or woman in 10 moves playing white, or that he traveled to Yugoslavia to frustrate the bearded masters at the Belgrade Chess Association, you think I was given to hyperbole. And if at dinner time I took you into the faint light of his Section 8 home, reeking of onions, liver, and gravy, his 6 little brothers fighting on a broken love seat for room in front of a cracked flat screen, one whose diaper sags, it's a wonder hasn't fallen to his ankles. The walls behind, doors exposing sheetrock, the perfect O of a handle, and the slats of stairs missing, where baby boy gets stuck trying to ascend to a dominion foreign to you and me, with its loud timbales and drums blasting down from the closed room of his cousin, whose mother stands on a corner on the other side of town all times of day and night, except when her relief check arrives at the beginning of the month. You'd get a better picture of Earl's ferocity after school on the board in Mr. Sherman's class, but not necessarily when he stands near you at a downtown bus stop in a jacket a size too small, hunching his shoulders around his ears as you imagine the checkered squares of his poverty and anger, and pray he does not turn his precise gaze too long in your direction, for fear he blames you and proceeds to take your queen. Thank you for listening to those poems and that little mini short piece about the poet's freedom.
Thank you so much, Major. That was very informative, so thank you. I'd like to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Major, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I'm actually going to start with a question of my own. So I wrote down a couple of a few sentences that really spoke to me, and I get the sense, really speaks to you as well. And I write my freedom, as well as writing is a form of action. So one of the things I'm really interested is your own journey, Major, into poetry. Kind of when it first spoke to you, when you discovered this side of yourself, that poetry was a way of writing your freedom and then a way of action.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interestingly enough, of course, it didn't begin there. It began because I was first and foremost a lover of music. I very much wanted to be, I was penning raps before I was penning poems, let's put it that way. And it grew into something that I found to be sustaining, just capturing as a young person, particularly in this country. It felt really important for me at the time, without any expectations of becoming a writer, that this was something that I found enormously pleasurable. I cannot honestly say I wanted to be a poet, but I did take poetry as an undergrad with one of America's finest poets, Sonia Sanchez. And I continued to write and write within a community of artists in Philadelphia, musicians, photographers, essayists, people who were journalists / essayists. And eventually that connected me with members of the Darkroom Collective, who were a group of aspiring writers and artists in Boston and Cambridge. I could drop names, but you can find them, the Darkroom Collective. And I just continued on. My undergraduate degree is accounting. And so it seemed like I was living this double life as a poet and someone who can read and tell a story through financial statements, So that's the short version. You can find more about it in the many interviews I've done, but I'll just add here that poetry began as music for me.
Well, look at that. And we're talking in this institute about lyrics and poetry. So perfect. So could you talk more about the tradition of the Golden Shovel poem and how you think this approach adds to your as well as others' writing?
Yeah. So 7 at the Golden Shovel is taken as a subtitle from a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, which is very, very popular, We Real Cool. And my friend Terrence Hayes, in homage to Gwendolyn Brooks, decided to create this form, Golden Shovel, where you take a line from Gwendolyn's poem and use it as the last word of lines that you have written. So her lines read vertically downward and your lines read horizontal. And that wedding of your text with Gwendolyn Brooks not only honors her, but it also shows the extent to which whatever poems we write come out of our foremothers and forefathers. Whitman, um, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks. He just made it explicit through that form, and I think that's one of the benefits, is that it makes you aware of the conversations, the many conversations that we are having um, through poetry. And also, I had a conversation with my friend, one of my friends, great Irish poet, the Keatsian Irish poet, and he cannot write one because he has a hard problem with prepositions at the ends of lines and conjunction. I can't say I don't blame him, but it's not for
you said that the reader needs to leave their borders to better understand your poetry. Have you found any way to help readers achieve this?
Yeah, hopefully on the surface of the poem is some artifice or use of language or sound or image that is the first kind of contact that seduces a reader inside the poem. But I think poems are really, really demanding. And one of the ways in which um, to overcome the difficulty or complexity of poems is to live with them, to carry them in your pocket, as the Academy of American Poets was trying to encourage people to do. Pull them out, read them out loud, bring those words into your body. And what I tell my students is to calibrate your breath to the breathing that is the poem, the pacing and rhythm of the poem. And by doing that, you feel yourself change when you enter into a consciousness that is not your own, much in the same way that actors take on lines of characters and are changed as a result. Um, Poetry can serve that particular function. It also means, I think, being ever present of one's own subjectivity, who one is when they make contact with the poem. My students, not all of them, but many of them want poems that are relatable. They want their lives reaffirmed. They want a mirror. They want the poem to serve as a mirror. And really the poem is a window into another life or another way of thinking and breathing, of walking, of talking, of culture. I always wince when they say that. I like this poem, it's relatable. What about all those people outside of your world that you think are not relatable, right? Then you're creating a certain kind of prison wall. Ooh, did I say prison wall? Oh my God, I said prison wall. That just came up out of nowhere. You're creating a prison wall from yourself when you think that way.
Um, it's interesting. Another poet, that we've visited with before, Richard Blanco, I'm sure you're familiar with him, talks about encountering students and individuals with metrophobia, which is the fear of poetry. It is something I suffered from. I will be completely honest with you. And the way you described how with your students and the difficulty and how demanding a poem is in carrying it around uh, is a really good way.
Mm.
Are there other suggestions you have for some, who just aren't comfortable
Mm-hmm.
with poetry?
Mm-hmm.
And so, please.
Yeah, for some of the participants in the Teachers Institute, I sent along my introduction to the Best American Poetry 2019 that I edited, in which I talk about even the most learned people, the smartest people I know are fearful of poetry. And so we're all in great company, right? Um, but here's what's interesting about poetry. I think if you, as John Keats, the British Romantic poet, says in a letter, avoid irritable reaching, avoid trying to find meaning and let the poem do its magic. And sometimes that magic is not, you're not going to know, for example, the meaning of 2 or 3 hour movie as soon as you walk out of the theater. You have to like ponder it, think through it. Same thing with classical music, right? You'll hear certain changes, you'll hear motifs, and you have to think about it. I don't know why we want to have a hallmark experience with the poem. Poems have to be lived with, and there's some poems that I've been reading for years, and their joys and delights are still feeding me.
Mm.
And I have that faith. Here's the other thing about poetry. It's an encounter with language, everyday language. And as a result, we all believe that we can attain meaning that fast because most language is used for communicative purpose. And if I say, David, I need a drink of water, you know exactly what I mean there. Poetry it uses everyday language, but it tries to elevate that language to the realm of art, artful language. And this has been enormously helpful for me on several registers. Words that are lyrical, that have a certain sound to it, really carry resonances. Secondly, it also makes me uber aware of when we are abusing language. So because of the artfulness and the demands as such, it's almost like when you encounter a garden or a painting. You come out of a museum exhibition and suddenly you have the world is brighter. You see shapes, you see lines a little bit more clear. I think reading poems attunes us to language in all of its particular functions. So I say, join the Church of Poetry, have faith in its magic and its work. I'm using church lightly.
No,
I grew up in a church. I bet I know that.
So do you start a poem with a challenge, either artistically or otherwise? So that's a question that we have.
I'm in a poetry group now, and we show up once a week with 3 words each, and we give each other 45 minutes to write a draft. And it's been so much fun. Of course, it was born out of the pandemic, but we're continuing it, of course. And I have, over the course of my 5 books, written a long poem called Urban Renewal that has its own set of rules. And I turn to it when I feel like the well is dry. I'll go back to that particular project. Poems begin in various ways. I mean, endless numbers of ways. You can imagine everything from a trip to Italy, suddenly I'm like a font, like poems are coming out of me because I'm around all this great beauty. It could begin with a headline, something I read that I've been teasing in my head or contemplating in my head, thinking through some issue. A lot of times it begins from a very simply a blank page. And I have to sit with that silence and push through to whatever words come to me at that moment and try to make sense.
How do you feel about memorizing a poem in terms of internalizing it?
How do I feel about memorizing and internalizing it?
As a way, in terms of
Yes.
internalizing it.
Yes. When I write the poem, I often read it out loud. And what I'm doing is I'm anticipating the next words, even though they're not there on the page, I'm trying to hear it. And as a result of that, most of the poems that I write, by the time I've done my 6th or 7th draft, I know it by heart. And so it is internalized, and that's interesting. But I have this competition with my students every year. If I recite more poems by others, not my own, more poems than they do as a group, then the highest grade they can get is a C. And so uh, it's a wonderful challenge. You know, at the end of the year, we're all standing up spontaneously reciting poems because it's big competition. But it's a great way of, as I said earlier, bringing the poem closer to yourself, bringing it into your bones and bloodstream. Um, and the more of the poems, I don't know if you've been at parties, it's like a party trick. I have some friends who can recite endless amounts of poems, and they're just cool people to be around. They're just smarter. So I'm just saying, if you know, I know some people go on diets. I'm gonna say, eat a lot of poetry, memorize a lot of poetry.
Occasionally, I will throw out what I remember of the love song J. Alfred Prufrock by Elliott.
Whoa!
So there you go.
Just threw down the gauntlet.
I did. Boom. So another question. Now you had mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois' quote that all art is propaganda. As a poet and artist, do you agree or disagree with that idea?
You know, I was in that particular passage. I was no, I do not believe all art is propaganda. Vehemently disagree with that. However, of course, as sentient human beings who care about the planet, care about each other, care about injustice, care about issues that impact large numbers of us, yeah, I'm going to put the pen to paper. A lot of times I'm debilitated if I read another kid has gone into a movie theater or a synagogue or a church and shot up some parishioners. I'm putting it makes me want to put my pen down. And it can be so debilitating because you wonder why. What is it all for? What is the meaning of this? And then, and this was the case with George Floyd last year, some friends who said, I just can't write. And I'm like, okay, this is like running a race. Pass the baton or pass the pencil. We got this. We got each other. And so our words become a way of continuing and continuing the fight for dignity and decency. Um, and we support each other, give each other encouragement through. I know I've been reading poems by some of these young poets, and it makes me want to get down, get in the jam, blow my horn,
Mhm.
not blow my horn, but
Right, right.
play my instrument among them because they're so tight, in the jam session, that is
How was
resistance.
how did the pandemic in any way affect? No, you moved. We talked about that during the pandemic, but just the state of the world. During a pandemic, did from your the way that you looked at the world and your poetry. How did the pandemic affect that at all?
I'm a silver lining kind of guy. Cup is half full. Definitely haunting the extent to which this virus impacted lives, impacted nations, impacted communities. I lost family, I lost friends, I lost people whose work I turned to. And yet, there was something early on for me that felt, as regards my own place in the world, my own work, that felt this is why we are called to do what we do.
Mhm.
I don't know if you remember, there were so many writings, poems that emerged around that time, anthologies to give consolation. Um, and I still believe it's not like war poetry where once the war is over, the poem. I think we will be living with the effects of this pandemic for a while. And one of the, a lot of people took up hobbies, learned a little bit more what the environment is going through right now. all the attendant issues will be there. And I'm so happy to not be an accountant, but be someone who can add their voice to whatever small measure of understanding or distraction. Uh, that's what I felt like at the. I published a book last year, The Absurd Man, and it was like dropped into um, a deep, deep, deep well to the center of the earth. No one, I mean, it did get reviewed, but for the most part, it was a big old vacuum last year, and I was so okay with that. I was just writing poems, continuing to write poems.
So speaking of, your process, one of our participants said that many of your poems feel ecstatic in some way. So is writing poetry ecstatic for you?
I am so happy that word is being employed tonight because it's something that I believe is at the core of my writing. When I am writing, much like if anyone has a passion or a hobby, it takes them to a place, and that inner place for me is one of joy. I can't believe I get to put words together that hopefully will find their way into the world. My big moment was, you know, we poets take whatever we can get. We don't have movies that are we don't have novels that are optioned into movies. But I had a poem on the New York public transportation, and if only I got a penny from every person that saw that poem, I probably could retire. Okay, $1, $10, $10. But there was, I heard from people who saw that particular poem. And once you understand what poems mean to people who you don't know, you can only just relish in that space. So I'm transferring my energy. I feel like that's what I'm doing. I'm transferring my joy, my worldview. I'm taking that from the poet Charles Olson in his book Projective Verse. It's what we do.
And another question with emotions. This one's a little bit different. What are your rage poems?
Rage?
Yeah, rage poems.
Yeah, I leave that to people whose temperament is that. I mean, I do have rage poems, but they're probably not loud enough for people who want Black folk to be rageful, because there's something expected in that. And I prefer a seething kind of anger rather than more overt. Someone asked me that once at a writer's conference, and then they read my poems. They said, "Where's your rage?" Which felt really confrontational. And then they heard me read. They said, "Oh, it's in the lines."
So this could be our last question of the evening. And this is a request for a recommendation. Do you have a book about poetry by a poet, aside from yourself, that you could recommend?
I think Edward Hirsch is probably one of the clearest poet critics writing today about the urgency of what he calls human scale poems. And you can pick up any of his books. He has a recent book. I think the most recent one is 100 Poems That Will Break You. And yeah, so I want to advocate for Eddie's book, because he very, very clear prose, a kind of enthusiasm and joy for the poem that doesn't feel academic, very accessible. And he has the understanding of how poetry is a really, really crucial aspect of our cultural, America's cultural landscape. So I'm advocating for Edward Hirsch.
Edward Hirsch. Major, thank you so much for tonight. Major Jackson, the author of 5 books, his most recent one, you mentioned last year, you can find it at your local bookstore, including, in the community where you are. Major, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. We look forward to hearing you from tomorrow morning, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, David. Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Good night, everyone.